There's a silence beneath every failure, one not born from laziness, but from disconnection. Discipline, you've been told, is a chore, a burden, a rigid structure that suffocates freedom. But what if that belief is the very chain holding you back? What if every missed commitment isn't a sign of weakness, but a message from your unconscious, begging you to return to yourself? Carl Jung didn't view discipline as punishment. He saw it as a path to individuation, the painful, sacred journey of becoming whole. This isn't about motivation. This is about remembering. And once you see what you've forgotten, you'll realize you were never undisciplined. You were just out of alignment with who you really are. In this video, we will not chase productivity. We will seek sovereignty, not the noisy kind that performs for others, but the quiet kind that keeps its word in the dark. Because once you touch the root of your fragmentation, discipline will no longer be an effort, it will be a return, and you'll never avoid it again. 1. The fracture. Within somewhere between your ambition and your actions, a split took root. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't dramatic. It happened quietly, like a hairline crack in a wall you didn't notice until years later when the foundation started to shake. And by then, it wasn't just a crack, it was a chasm. One part of you still dreams, plans, swears change is coming. The other part knows you won't follow through. And that knowledge sits heavy, not as shame, but as estrangement. We often think of discipline as a tool we lack, but Carl Jung would call it a symbol, one that points to our relationship with the self. When you abandon discipline, you're not just delaying a task. You're walking away from your own potential, leaving it standing there, unreconciled. That abandonment becomes ritual, not the kind that brings clarity, but the kind that turns delay into identity. And over time, you stop believing the words you say to yourself. What people call laziness is often nothing more than the grief of repeated self-betrayal. You told yourself you'd wake up early. You didn't. You promised you'd eat clean, finish that project, finally commit. But each unkept promise forms a scar, not one that others see, but one your unconscious never forgets. That's not procrastination. That's spiritual erosion. Jung suggested that what we suppress becomes our shadow. But most people misunderstand this. They think the shadow is only rage, lust, or violence. They forget it also contains nobility, strength, order, clarity, the very parts of you that would bring structure to your life. When these elements are disowned, they don't disappear. They haunt you in subtle ways. They distort your days into confusion, your efforts into scattered bursts of unsustained momentum. So now you wonder why you can't stay consistent. But how can you, when the version of you that holds discipline has been buried beneath the rubble of unhealed discouragement? It's not that you're lazy. It's that you're lost in a story that no longer fits, a narrative that began years ago when effort was punished, when initiative was ridiculed, when consistency was met with indifference. You learned not to try too hard, not because you didn't care, but because it hurt more to care and fail than to not try at all. This fracture is where the work begins, not in your schedule, but in your psyche. To move forward, you must return, not to nostalgia, but to the original wound, the first memory where order and pain met, the moment where doing your best wasn't enough, and so you began doing less. Not to sabotage, but to protect your spirit from breaking entirely. The man who avoids discipline isn't weak. He's weary from carrying unresolved pain. But if you listen closely, you'll hear the sound beneath the silence, a voice that never stopped whispering, "There's more in you." It's time to stop ignoring that call, not by force, but by finally telling the truth. You're not undisciplined, you're divided. 2. The lie of effort. Every time someone says, "You just need to try harder," a part of you shuts down. Not because it's wrong, but because it's incomplete. Effort alone doesn't lead to transformation. Identity does. Carl Jung observed that people do not become whole by adding new traits. They become whole by uncovering the truths they've buried. Discipline, then, is not something you bolt onto your life. It's something you excavate. It was always there, dormant, not absent. But modern culture feeds you the opposite. Hustle harder, work more hours, stack habits on top of a life built on fractured beliefs. You burn out, not because you're incapable, but because you're misaligned. You are trying to construct a cathedral on a foundation of quicksand, and so you fail, repeatedly. And each failure becomes evidence for the inner narrative that you're not the kind of person who follows through. But that narrative wasn't born from your failures. It created them. Until you see that, you will confuse self-punishment for progress. Jung once said that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. And that's precisely why most people fail at discipline. They don't want to see the truth, that they've avoided order not because they didn't understand it, but because they were afraid of what it might ask of them. Because real discipline demands you stop pretending, that you stop hiding behind intentions, that you abandon the identity built on one-day thinking. It demands your presence, not just in moments of motivation, but in the moments when nobody's watching and everything in you wants to vanish back into distraction. True effort doesn't look like struggle, it looks like alignment. And when your actions emerge from the foundation of who you actually believe you are, discipline stops being a fight. It becomes breath, natural, quiet, constant. You must ask yourself, who are you becoming when no one is looking? Not what you hope to become, not what you've posted online, but what your life right now proves. Your choices aren't isolated. They accumulate. They echo into your identity. You're not just skipping the gym or snoozing your alarm. You're reinforcing a version of yourself that cannot hold the weight of its own ambition. Jung believed that to confront the shadow is to find the gold hidden in darkness. So it is with discipline. You won't find it in grand gestures or forced inspiration. You'll find it when you confront the false identity that effort alone is enough. It never was. 3. The mirror that doesn't lie. The most confronting moment isn't when someone criticizes you, it's when your own reflection no longer looks familiar. Not because your features have changed, but because the man you see isn't the one you once promised to become. Every broken commitment, every delayed habit, every quiet compromise stacks in the psyche until your reflection feels like a stranger. Jung called this the persona, the mask we wear to appear functional while our true self hides in exile. And discipline dies behind that mask. It's easy to trick others, much harder to trick the mirror. We don't speak enough about the quiet guilt of living out of sync. You aren't haunted by failure because you didn't try. You're haunted because you know you didn't give your full self permission to try. You rationed your potential to avoid looking foolish. But in doing so, you betrayed the part of you that needed courage, not control. There's an unspoken pain in knowing you're living as a fragment, that you're capable of more, but you're watching yourself settle. For convenience, for approval, for fear of the solitude that comes with growth. Jung's theory of individuation is not about success. It's about integration. It's about bringing home the parts of yourself you abandoned when life demanded you shrink. That abandoned self is still there. He shows up every time you flinch from responsibility, every time you rationalize distraction, every time you pretend that potential is enough. Discipline isn't rigid control, it's compassionate structure, a commitment to your own becoming. When you look in the mirror and see someone who keeps his word, not just to others, but to himself, something shifts. You no longer need applause. You no longer need permission. You remember who you are. But if the man in the mirror still carries doubt in his eyes, that's not failure, that's the signal, the call to return to truth, not as punishment, but as restoration. Because the real you has never left. He's just waiting for you to look closely enough and finally recognize him. 4. The rebellion beneath routine. You don't resist structure because you hate it. You resist it because it reminds you of something deeper, something unresolved. Every time you begin a new plan, a subtle tension rises, a quiet protest from within. Not loud, not obvious, but persistent. You set a goal, and days later, find yourself drifting from it. Not by accident, but almost by design. Carl Jung would call this the resistance of the psyche to fragmentation. When your conscious intention clashes with an unconscious identity, sabotage isn't a mistake, it's a message. The real struggle with discipline isn't the difficulty of tasks. It's the dissonance between what you claim to want and what part of you is still afraid to become. You're not failing because you're undedicated. You're failing because your inner architecture has not caught up with your outer ambition. You've likely felt it, the initial excitement of planning, followed by the slow unraveling of motivation. It's not laziness, it's the shadow doing its work, pulling you back to comfort, not because it's better, but because it's familiar. The subconscious prefers safety over evolution, and order to the unintegrated self feels dangerous. It implies permanence, exposure, accountability, all things your deeper self might not yet believe you can handle. So the rebellion begins. A snoozed alarm, a skipped workout, a delayed decision. The betrayal is subtle, but it carries weight. Over time, you stop trusting yourself, not because you didn't care, but because you never learned how to stay present with your own discomfort. Jung taught that every symptom has a story. The story behind your undisciplined patterns isn't incompetence, it's unhealed experience. Perhaps you learned early that success brought pressure, or that being organized invited criticism. So you adapted, not logically, but emotionally. To embrace discipline fully, you must examine the rebellion without condemnation. Ask not, why do I keep quitting? But, what am I afraid consistency will expose? You'll find the answer isn't weakness, it's pain. And that pain doesn't need to be conquered, it needs to be understood. Structure without healing will always collapse. But when discipline becomes an act of restoration instead of force, resistance fades. You're no longer wrestling with yourself. You're remembering who you were before the rebellion began. 5. The silence of the shadow self. There is a version of you you've been avoiding for years, not because he's broken, but because he holds a power you're not sure you're ready to claim. He isn't chaotic. He isn't weak. In fact, he's the opposite. Focused, unshaken, sovereign. This is the part of you Jung would describe as the noble archetype, the king, the guide, the master of order. And you've hidden him, not out of malice, but out of survival. You see, at some point your strength made others uncomfortable. Your intensity was too sharp for the room, so you dulled yourself. You muted the voice that demanded excellence. You learned to shrink, to hesitate, to apologize for your fire. That version of you didn't vanish. He was buried. And the more years passed, the more distant he felt, until you began to believe he never existed at all. But here's the truth. The part of you capable of building a life of structure never left. He simply went quiet, waiting for a moment when you'd be ready to lead without shame. Most people think discipline is found in more effort, but Jung would argue it's found in deeper integration. You cannot fake alignment. If part of you still feels like you're playing a role, eventually the mask will fall. That's why discipline must come not from force, but from wholeness. You don't need to kill the lazy part of you. You need to speak with him. Listen. What is he trying to protect you from? What memory is he shielding you from reliving? Perhaps it's failure. Perhaps it's judgment. Perhaps it's simply the fatigue of having tried before and been met with silence. When you see this, everything changes. Discipline stops being a battlefield. It becomes a reunion, a remembering. Not of a better version of yourself, but of your original design, the one who knew how to rise early, move with purpose, speak with clarity, not because he was performing, but because he was aligned. The shadow doesn't hate you, it fears your forgetting, and it will resist until you return, not to punishment, but to presence. That's the key Jung offers, not domination of the self, but reconciliation. 6. when routine becomes reverence. At first, discipline feels mechanical. You set alarms, follow checklists, track habits like a scientist observing an experiment. There's a stiffness to it, as if you're impersonating someone you hope to become. You treat routine like a tool, something to wield, not something to live. But if you stay with it long enough, something shifts. Carl Jung often emphasized the symbolic weight of repetition. When a behavior moves beyond the surface and begins to echo through the unconscious, it stops being an action and starts becoming identity. That is the turning point. When routine stops being forced and starts being sacred. It doesn't happen in a single moment. It reveals itself in fragments. One morning you rise, not because you should, but because it feels right. One afternoon you begin working, not out of guilt, but because there is an inner calm that beckons you to create. The structure you once resisted becomes the space where your deeper self can finally speak. This is the moment discipline matures into something deeper. Ritual. Ritual is not mere habit, it's the practice of aligning daily life with unseen values. It's how you give form to your interior world. A man who returns to his process again and again isn't obsessed with control. He is in conversation with meaning. This is where many people give up. They never cross the threshold. They treat consistency as drudgery and never stay long enough to experience its transformation. They see discipline as a cage, never realizing it becomes a sanctuary. You don't need more intensity. You need more fidelity. Not the rush of progress, but the quiet power of doing the same thing with presence. When you learn to stay with the repetition, not just to complete it, but to embody it, something ancient awakens. It's not loud, it doesn't announce itself, but you begin to sense it, a rhythm that hums beneath the noise of modern life. You begin to move differently, not because you're chasing an outcome, but because you're expressing an oath. Ritual is how the sovereign man protects his time, not just from distraction, but from forgetfulness. The world will always try to pull you away from yourself, but a ritual brings you back. It returns you to the agreement you made not with others, but with your own becoming. Jung would say this is individuation made visible when the fragmented self returns to center. It looks like discipline, but it feels like peace. And eventually, the ritual disappears. Not because it's gone, but because it has fused with who you are. 7. The man who walks alone. There comes a point in every man's journey when comfort turns into a prison, not because life is difficult, but because his soul begins to rebel against delay. You feel it in your bones, the quiet dissatisfaction of days that look full but feel hollow. You no longer tolerate your own avoidance, not because you're angry, but because you're done pretending that half measures are enough. This is the breaking point, not of discipline, but of illusion. Carl Jung once wrote that the greatest confrontation is with oneself. But most never reach that moment because the cost is solitude. To live with discipline is to accept a kind of separation, not from the world, but from the version of you that still seeks to be understood before he acts. The disciplined man walks alone, not because no one joins him, but because he no longer waits to be accompanied. He no longer performs for recognition. He doesn't organize his day to prove anything. He builds structure because chaos has already robbed him of too much time. He trains not to fix something broken, but to reclaim what was always his. This kind of man is misunderstood. He turns down invitations not out of arrogance, but because he's building something no one else can see yet. He doesn't explain his boundaries. He doesn't announce his return. He simply begins showing up in silence, where before he fled. But this isn't isolation, it's initiation. To walk with discipline is to accept the responsibility of vision. You see further now. You know what's at stake. You understand that every delayed decision costs you something irretrievable, not just time, but integrity. This is why discipline cannot be borrowed. It must be built, piece by piece, morning by morning, decision by decision. Each choice not just a task, but a test. Will you stay with the path, even when no one is watching? Jung believed that maturity was not found in knowledge, but in integration. To become whole, you must stop trading your power for comfort. You must bury the man who waits, and not with shame, but with honor. He served you, he kept you safe, but he cannot walk this path. Now the burden is yours to carry. But here's the truth. It doesn't get heavier. It gets clearer. Each step forward reclaims a part of yourself. Each act of order restores the blueprint, and slowly the fog lifts. You see yourself again. Not the version full of doubt, but the one who acts without hesitation. Discipline isn't about achieving more. It's about becoming someone who can't live any other way. So walk alone if you must, but walk forward. Not in defiance, but in devotion. And soon you'll look back, not with regret, but with reverence. Because the man you are now wouldn't exist if you hadn't finally said, enough. So now you know. Discipline isn't what you thought it was. It's not a grind, nor a punishment, nor a badge of honor. It's a mirror. One that doesn't reflect what you're doing, but who you've decided to become. Carl Jung taught us that the unconscious runs our lives until we make it conscious. And in the realm of discipline, that means facing the fractured stories, the abandoned strengths, and the internal exiles we've buried beneath comfort. This isn't about becoming perfect, it's about becoming unified. Because the man who can hold his chaos without being ruled by it is not controlled by the world, he commands it. Every small decision to follow through is a signal to your psyche. I am safe, I am here, I am whole. And so the time has come, not for a new plan, not for another system, but for a new standard, the kind that doesn't need permission, the kind that lives in rhythm, not in hype. You will fail, yes, but now you'll fail forward as someone who no longer avoids the weight of becoming. You are no longer hiding behind potential. You are no longer stalling in the name of someday. You are not waiting for the perfect moment. This is the moment. The contract has been signed. The king within you has stirred. And from this breath forward, you'll never avoid discipline again, not because it's easy, but because it's sacred.